Hello and welcome. Having stated his thesis that faith without works is dead, that it cannot save, that it is useless, James turns to the case of Abraham to show that he, like all others, was saved or justified by a living faith and not by a dead faith, a faith that is alone. He says in James chapter 2, beginning in verse 21, "Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar?" You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, "And Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Believing Abraham was justified by works, but by whom was he justified? Some people have thought that it cannot be God who justified him, but men, people like you and me. We are the ones who justify the patriarch by his works. But it is evident from the fact that Paul refers to Genesis 15:6, that it is God who does the justifying. But some of them may say, well, this would contradict Paul, what he said in Romans 4, beginning in verse 1. And it would also mean that God justifies the believer more than once throughout his life. Well, due to time constraints, in this lesson I will deal only with the first objection, and I will deal with the second in another lesson. Now, as pointed out in our last study, there must be some ambiguity in the language Paul and James use, or there will be an actual contradiction in what they say. The ambiguity is not in the word faith, for neither James nor Paul knows of justifying faith, which is alone. Consider Paul's opening remarks to the Romans. He says that his apostleship was bestowed on him through grace to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles. Romans 1 and verse 5. In chapter 6 of Romans, speaking of the time when believers were freed from their slavery from sin, he says, "But thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which you were committed, and having been freed from sin, you became slaves of righteousness." Verses 17 and 18. When were believers freed from the guilt of sin, which is what justification really is? Well, it is when they became obedient from the heart to that form of teaching to which they were committed. Listen, dear friends, what matters to God, says the Apostle Paul, is faith working through love. Galatians 5 and verse 6. There is no other faith that can justify, no other faith that can save. Now, historically speaking, John Calvin and Martin Luther and Wesley as well taught that faith which is alone, faith which is by itself, faith which is without obedience to Jesus, they taught that faith which does not work is able to save a man, is able to justify a man before God. Well, Paul does not teach this, and neither does James, and neither does any other inspired man. Each of these men knew of only one kind of saving faith, and that is faith which is not alone, faith which obeys the gospel. The ambiguity between Paul and James lies in how they use the word works. In Romans 3 and verse 24, Paul says that men are justified as a gift by his grace, and God is talking about God's grace. The Greek word translated justified in this place speaks of the relationship that one has to a standard of law. It refers to the verdict of acquittal handed down by a judge. It means to judge a person to be righteous, to be right, to be free from guilt. Those who are justified have nothing against them. They are not guilty in the eyes of the law. Grace means goodwill, loving kindness, favor, and therefore the apostle is speaking about a legal verdict that is undeserved, of a justification or of a righteousness that is bestowed upon believers through the goodwill or the favor of God, the judge. Now, what some miss when they study the book of Romans is that Paul also speaks of a justification, of a righteousness which is not based upon grace, but upon doing the law. Here's a summary of what he says, beginning in chapter 2, verse 12. "For all who have sinned without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are just before God, but the doers of the law will be justified." Speaking to those who are not Christians, Paul says that it is the doer of the law who will be justified. Now, some have mistakenly thought that Paul was speaking about those law keepers who were doing the best that they could, but who sometimes fail to do all that they could. However, this view ignores the context. In chapters 1 through 3, Paul's primary concern is to show the universal need for the gospel. He does this by showing that all have sinned. It does not matter, listen, it does not matter that they did not mean to sin. What matters is that they did sin. For the law only justifies the innocent, those who have never sinned. In Romans 1, he shows the Gentiles are guilty of sin and are in need of the righteousness revealed in the gospel. In chapter 2, he shows that the Jew, too, with all of his superior advantages, was a sinner in need of the gospel. He asked the Jew in chapter 2 and verse 21, "You, therefore, who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one shall not steal, do you steal? You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." In chapter 3, he continues to ask the Jew, "What then? Are we better than they? No, not at all. For we have already charged both Jews and Greeks are all under sin." That's Romans 3 and verse 9. Paul's verdict is in keeping with what the law itself says, because beginning in verse 10 of Romans 3, he begins to name one scripture after another, showing the sinfulness of humanity. He begins by saying, "There is none righteous, no, not even one." And then he says, "All have turned aside. Together they have become useless." In showing these things, Paul's point has been to show that the whole world is guilty of sin and liable to punishment. Listen to his conclusion in verses 19 and 20. Now we know, therefore, now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be closed and all the world may become accountable to God, because by the works of the law no flesh will be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Paul mentions a twofold purpose of the law in speaking as it does about mankind's sinfulness. Number one, that every mouth may be closed. This speechlessness is the result of overwhelming evidence that is presented against us, confirming that instead of being doers of the law, doing what we have required, we are instead sinners. Paul is describing the condition of a man who is convicted of guilt. He is rendered speechless by the evidence that has been presented against him. He does not know what to say, so his mouth is stopped. That's the first point. The second point is that all the world may become accountable to God. The word accountable is from a Greek word hupodikos, and refers to one who has lost his suit. It means liable to judgment or punishment. Creamer, in his Biblico-Theological Lexicon of New Testament Greek, says it denotes one who is bound to do or suffer what is imposed for the sake of justice because he has neglected to do what was right. The reason why every mouth is stopped and all the world is liable to punishment is stated in verse 20. Listen, "Because by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for through the law comes the knowledge of sin." Remember, justified means to have that one has been accounted or judged righteous, not guilty. In this sense, no one has been judged righteous in the eyes of God on the basis of his works, on the basis of keeping the law. For such works would have to be perfect in every way. But instead of declaring man innocent, what the law actually does to the individual who seeks to be justified through the law, well, it exposes his sin. It declares him to be a sinner and guilty. Through the law, man learns that instead of being righteous, he is a sinner. Through the law, says the apostle, comes the knowledge of sin. The works that Paul speaks of in Romans and in Galatians the works that he speaks of, are not works we do in obedience to the gospel for the forgiveness of sins, which would make it a matter of grace. The works that Paul speaks of are works that make salvation a matter of debt. He speaks of works which nullify grace. We are declared just, innocent, not because we are forgiven, but because we have never sinned, and no one shall be justified through such works, because of all have sinned and all have fallen short of the glory of God. No one, my friend, can be justified before God on the basis of his good life. None are innocent. All are guilty. All stand condemned by law, and all are under the wrath of God. All need forgiveness. Paul brought us to this point so we can realize how desperate we are in need of the gospel. So while Paul speaks of works which have nothing to do with grace, with justifying a sinner, James speaks of works which perfect faith and which justifies a man before God. We have here, in our next lesson, I will say more about the first point. Sorry for rushing, but that's just the nature of the beast.